more likely than not, you are at least somewhat familiar with the video game crash of 1983, a massive recession that nearly wiped out the entire video game industry. In a future video, we will certainly go more in depth on the 83 crash, as there are a lot of misconceptions about it that people still believe to this day. What most people don't know is that 1983 was not the first time the video game market collapsed. The first crash actually occurred 6 years before, in 1977. The crash of 77 was a very significant event, yet remains one of the more forgotten pieces of video game history. To put the magnitude of this crash into context, in 1971, the video game industry was only worth around $1 billion. However, by 1976, the industry's value grew to $25 billion. Things seemed like they were only going up, but then 1977 came, the first year in which the video game industry generated less revenue compared to the previous year, dropping 12% from $25 billion to $22 billion. The recession was fully realized by 1978, when industry revenue fell an additional 32% to $15 billion. Before we discuss the root causes of the 77 crash, let's go back to 1972, the most significant year in video game history, because that year, an electronics company named Magnavox released the first commercial home gaming system, the Odyssey. Now, anyone familiar with the Odyssey is aware of how primitive its technology was. The game cartridges, if you want to call them games, contained PCB jumper cables that slightly modified what appeared on the screen, which was always some minor variation of a table tennis style game. And there was no color, no sound, and only 3 pixels were displayed at any given time. Now, being the first console in history, the Odyssey absolutely deserves its own video, so we will cover it extensively on this channel in the future. But for now, what's important to know about the Odyssey is that it is by far the most influential device in the history of the video game industry, and that is no exaggeration. Not only was it the first console, which on its own is a huge innovation and technological milestone, but it directly transformed the video game industry from a niche market that wasn't very profitable into a viable commercial enterprise. Although it didn't take the world by storm when it was released, it inspired Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari, to create a similar table tennis type experience for the arcade. The name of that game is Pong, of course, the first commercially successful video game in history. It was released in 1972, a few months after the release of the Odyssey. Although on the surface, Pong seems to be a carbon copy of the Odyssey, Atari's version of table tennis was more attractive to a mainstream audience, as it included a built-in scoreboard instead of having to memorize the score of each player on the Odyssey. More importantly though, inserting quarters into an arcade machine was far more accessible to consumers than spending $100 on a home console back then. $100 may not seem like a lot, but understand, when adjusted for inflation, the Odyssey would have cost consumers close to $600 in 2019. Needless to say, the Odyssey, although not a complete commercial failure for its time, it was able to sell 325,000 units, still was not very appealing to the general consumer compared to the arcade experience that was more affordable, practical, and an overall more enjoyable gaming experience. But over time, there was increasing demand from consumers to be able to play table tennis at home. The success of Pong would ultimately lead to increased sales for the Odyssey, and when the Odyssey became outdated, Magnavox released updated versions of their original console in 1975 to include scoreboards and other important features that consumers came to expect from a table tennis game. In response to this increasing demand for home consoles, Atari would develop their own, called the Pong Home, released in late 1975. By 76, several other companies entered the market with their own Pong-inspired systems, including Coleco's Telstar, Philips Telegame, Entek's Game Room Telepong, APF TV Fun, Radio Shack's TV Scoreboard. I can go on and on talking about all the different consoles that were released at this point. Throughout the first generation of consoles, over 200 manufacturers entered the market. To put them just to understand how huge that is, we only have 3 in 2019. But back then, you had 200 different companies making their own console. And when you include all the console variations of the Odyssey series, Telstar series, Pong series, and so on, there were at least 500 individual consoles released during the first generation. all of which were only capable of playing one game, table tennis. Needless to say, the console market was oversaturated. The video game industry's success throughout most of the 1970s relied exclusively on that one table tennis game. Despite all the competition in the market, each and every one of those consoles were functionally the same, providing the same exact table tennis experience as one another. The console manufacturers were uninterested in providing new and innovative gameplay experiences, instead wishing to capitalize on the popularity and success of table tennis. But that popularity and success can only last so long before consumers would become fatigued and lose interest. It seems almost unfathomable that a multi-billion-dollar industry would fail to realize this, but understand that the video game market was new and uncharted territory in the 1970s. The technology to develop new games were very expensive at the time, and many feared the huge financial risk in such an undertaking, because Pong and the table tennis experience is what made video games mainstream in the first place. So, the prospect of creating a brand new experience different from what consumers had been accustomed to was very intimidating, so nobody really wanted to take that risk. But that lack of innovation would become detrimental to the industry's growth. The gaming industry continues to expand today because it doesn't rely on a single game or gameplay experience to generate growth. Tired of the yearly Call of Duty cycle? Not only do you have other first-person shooters to play, but if you're just not interested in shooting games, there are so many different genres to choose from. Adventure games, role-playing games, sports games, fighting games, and so much more. Not only that, but you have real competition in the marketplace these days. Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft, and others provide unique and innovative experiences that distinguish each platform from one another. Compare all of that to the early to mid-70s, where all that growth was dependent on a single gameplay experience, table tennis. If you already bought an Odyssey, there is no reason for you to buy a Home Pong or Telstar console because there is no difference. Not only that, but the video game industry since the second generation has continued to grow due to software sales. But every console literally had the same game built into it and lacked the ability to play other games, so once you own the system, there really was no more money to be made. With all this in mind, console sales naturally declined over time. Once everyone had one, there was no reason to buy another one, and no additional software sales for manufacturers to continue making money, because the hardware and software were one and the same. The consumers inevitably became tired of playing table tennis over and over and over again, so these Pong consoles simply weren't selling anymore and just sat there on store shelves. To clear inventory and cut their losses, manufacturers marked down their prices before exiting the console market. So out of all the 200 plus manufacturers that made consoles during the first generation, only 20 of them would remain in the market by the next generation of consoles. Had the second generation of consoles come a year sooner, perhaps, I would suspect that the market would have bounced back much faster. Atari actually planned to release the 2600 in 1976, but plans changed when Magnavox took legal action against Atari over the rights to table tennis and were granted licensing rights to all new Atari products for the next year. To avoid this, Atari simply delayed the release of all their new products by 1 year, so that's why the 2600 didn't come out until the following year, 1977. But even when the 2600 was finally released, it wasn't really flying off the shelves. Sure, it was able to sell 350,000 units in its first year, but as is the case with any new hardware, it took time for the consoles to take off and gain a large install base. Especially when you consider that arcades were still far more accessible than home consoles. The 2600 launched at $199 in 1977, which is about $822 in today's money. The average person was simply unable to afford it. That, with the added confusion consumers face when being presented a new console that was not dedicated to play any particular game, it made the 2600 fail to make any money during the first few years of its life cycle due to low consumer interest. The release of the 2600 actually helped contribute to the crash. The losing interest in Pong and the industry's over-dependence on Pong to make money was the primary cause for the crash because Pong consoles stopped selling once everyone already had one, right? So with the first-gen technology becoming obsolete and having already reached its peak, the new generation of consoles needed to make up for the losses caused by the previous generation. But that didn't happen. Sales were so far below expectations in 1978 that Atari's parent company, Warner Communications, had to invest more money into Atari to keep the business operational. It was not making money, it was losing money. So by the end of 1978, Bushnell was ousted from the company, and it wouldn't be until 1980 that the 2600 was finally profitable. and by then the industry had fully bounced back from the 77 recession. So how did that happen? How did the recovery happen? So if we think of Pong as the game that started it all and got people interested in video games as a medium, Space Invaders was the game that helped revitalize that interest. The gameplay experience was new, exciting, like nothing anyone's ever seen before. The on-rail shooting experience was like nothing that you've ever seen before compared to table tennis. It definitely helped that the game was released right around the time of Star Wars and the growing influence of sci-fi in pop culture. But once Space Invaders was out in 1978, people had a reason to go back to the arcades again, because the arcades were also struggling because all of the arcade cabinets were table tennis. So to go along with people not buying consoles, people also weren't going to the arcades, which also greatly contributed to the crash. So the success of Space Invaders and the new growth of the arcade market translated into consoles as well. Remember earlier when we talked about how Pong caused the success of home consoles? Well, Space Invaders ended up doing exactly the same thing for the Atari 2600, because when the game was ported to the 2600 in 1980, sales for the console quadrupled just in that year alone. Right after Space Invaders came out, the total sales of the 2600 quadrupled, which is just insane, because consumers wanted a way to play Space Invaders at home. Sound familiar? Throughout the early 1980s, more blockbuster arcade games would be released, such as Asteroid, Centipede, and Pac-Man, and it's no coincidence that the 2600 ports of these arcade games ended up becoming the best-selling games for that console. These arcade games not only recovered the arcade market, but the console market as well. But only a few years after the industry started to recover from the 1977 crash, another major recession would hit the video game industry in 1983. It would turn out that the effects of the 1977 crash would influence the market in a way that led to the more devastating and significant 1983 crash, and we'll get into that in due time. To summarize the crash of 1977 in 3 words: too much Pong. Every arcade game released back then was Pong, all the consoles were Pong. So when people got tired of playing Pong, they stopped buying new consoles, they stopped going to the arcade, and once the new technology did come out, it still took a long time for that technology to take off, so the industry was still in a recession because the new consoles weren't really doing anything to revitalize the video game industry. So you don't hear too many conversations about it, but that's essentially how the video game industry lost over $10 billion in 2 years. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you later. Bye.